Ever think about how much we actually rely on the internet for basically everything? Banking and communication and entertainment.
Even national security.
Yeah, I mean, it all travels through these undersea cables.
Or these hidden arteries.
Yeah, the digital world. And today we're diving deep into a story about just how vulnerable these cables can be.
Especially for an island nation like Taiwan.
Exactly. An island nation.
It's pretty fascinating when you think about it. These cables, thousands of feet, sometimes below the ocean surface.
Oh, yeah.
Carrying vast amounts of data at lightning speed.
Yeah.
But they're fragile.
Oh, yeah.
Susceptible to accidents and increasingly intentional sabotage.
Yeah, we're taking you to the Taiwan Strait,
Yeah.
a region already kind of brimming with geopolitical tension.
Right.
Where recent events have raised alarms about the security of these undersea lifelines. Our source for this deep dive is a YouTube video
Okay.
in firstpost titled, After Ukraine, Taiwan. China threatened Trump's diplomacy to test Taipei Vantage with Palki Sharma. Get ready to uncover damaged cables, suspicious ships, and the unpredictable role of Trump-era diplomacy.
I think it's worth starting with why this matters so much to Taiwan.
Yeah.
As an island, its connection to the outside world depends heavily on these undersea cables.
Right.
They're the backbone of its economy.
Huh?
Military communications and connection to allies
Right.
disrupt those cables, and you essentially isolate Taiwan.
Yeah. So what happened with that damaged cable in the Taiwan Strait? Was there any evidence pointing to sabotage?
So a Taiwanese telecom company reported damage to one of its cables.
Okay.
And shortly after, a Togo-flagged cargo ship with a Chinese crew was found operating suspiciously near the damaged area.
Okay.
Now, accidents do happen, but the circumstances were definitely unusual.
Right.
The Taiwanese Coast Guard attempted to communicate with the ship, but when they received no response, they detained the ship and its crew.
I find it interesting that China was quick to dismiss Taiwan's concerns attributing the damage to common maritime accidents.
Right.
Given their increasingly assertive actions in the region, it's hard not to be at least a little skeptical.
It certainly raises questions.
Yeah.
And this wasn't an isolated incident.
Right.
Taiwan has actually compiled a list of 50 suspicious ships operating near their cables.
Wow.
Many with unclear ownership and a pattern of lingering in the area for extended periods.
It sounds like a cat and mouse game out there on the high seas.
Yeah.
Is there any way to know who owns these ships and what their intentions are?
Well, that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
The lack of transparency surrounding ownership makes it incredibly difficult to determine intent and attribute blame. But the potential threat is clear.
Right.
Just the previous month, another incident involved a Chinese-owned ship.
Okay.
This one registered in Cameroon called the Shuning 39.
Right.
It managed to evade investigation, which only adds to the mystery and suspicion.
This whole situation is giving me serious deja vu. Didn't something similar happen in Europe recently?
You're right to make that connection.
Yeah.
Since October 2023, at least 11 Baltic cables have been damaged.
Wow.
And there are strong suspicions of Russian sabotage, though concrete evidence has been difficult to obtain.
Yeah.
It highlights the vulnerability of this infrastructure
Right.
on a global scale.
It makes you realize that these seemingly mundane cables are actually strategic assets.
Right.
Whoever controls them or has the ability to disrupt them holds a significant amount of power.
Absolutely. And this is where things get even more complicated.
Oh,
The US and NATO have been stepping up efforts to protect these cables.
okay.
But then comes the Trump factor. His America First foreign policy and his warmer relationship with Russia created a lot of uncertainty about America's commitment to its allies,
Including Taiwan.
including Taiwan.
Remember all the talk about his transactional approach to diplomacy?
Right?
It makes you wonder if he saw Taiwan's dependence on these cables as a bargaining chip. There were even reports of him possibly demanding a stake in TSMC, the world's largest semiconductor maker based in Taiwan, as a concession.
Wow.
Can you imagine? A global superpower, essentially holding another country's internet hostage for economic gain.
It really underscores how precarious Taiwan's position is.
Yeah.
If the US, their main ally, is perceived as unreliable, what options do they have left?
Right.
Do they try to appease China?
Yeah.
Do they seek new alliances elsewhere?
It seems like the whole global chessboard got reshuffled during the Trump years.
Yeah.
And the rules of the game, especially when it comes to international relations and cybersecurity, are still being rewritten.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this brings us to a crucial point.
Okay.
The U.S. has long maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan.
You know, that term has always confused me a bit. Can you break down what strategic ambiguity actually means in this context?
Sure. It essentially means the U.S. provides Taiwan with weapons and support, but deliberately avoids stating outright whether they would intervene militarily if
Right.
China attacked. The idea is to deter China without provoking them.
Got it.
But with Trump's unpredictable behavior and his questioning of U.S. commitments,
Right.
even that delicate balance was thrown into question.
It's unsettling to think that something as seemingly simple as an undersea cable could become like a flashpoint in a global power struggle.
It really highlights how interconnected our world is, and how actions in one region can ripple outwards with far-reaching consequences.
Right.
The incident with the damaged cable in the Taiwan Strait
Right.
and the suspicious activities of those ships
Yeah.
raises a lot of important questions about the future of not just Taiwan, but global communication and internet infrastructure.
You know, I was reading about how these undersea cables are essentially like the nervous system of the global economy. They carry trillions of dollars in financial transactions every single day.
That's right.
It's a lot.
And imagine the disruption if those cables were cut on a larger scale.
Oh, yeah.
Financial markets could freeze. Governments would lose the ability to communicate effectively.
Yeah.
And everyday life as we know it would be thrown into chaos.
Right.
It's not an exaggeration to say that our way of life depends on these cables.
This first post video we're analyzing also touched on something I found fascinating. The idea that these undersea cables are becoming a new battleground in the information war.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway here. It's not just about physical disruption anymore. It's about controlling the flow of information, shaping narratives,
Right.
and potentially even manipulating financial markets.
It's almost like a modern-day version of cutting telegraph lines, but with far greater consequences.
Exactly. In the past, disrupting communication lines might have slowed down the spread of information.
Yeah.
But today, cutting off a country's access to the internet could cripple its economy,
Right.
isolate its citizens, and severely impact its ability to function on the world stage.
We've already seen how disinformation and propaganda can spread online. But imagine if entire countries could be cut off from the global conversation.
Right.
Or have their financial systems deliberately destabilized through attacks on these cables.
It would be incredibly destabilizing, both politically and economically.
Yeah.
And the attribution problem we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
The difficulty of proving who's responsible for cable damage makes it even more challenging.
Right.
It creates an environment where countries can act with a degree of deniability.
It's like a ghost war fought in the depths of the ocean, with potentially huge consequences for the surface world. And the rules of engagement are still being written, which makes it all the more unnerving. How do you deter this kind of activity? How do you respond if it happens? These are questions without easy answers.
It's a whole new dimension of warfare. We talk about cybersecurity, but physical infrastructure like these undersea cables is just as vulnerable.
Yeah.
And maybe even harder to defend because it's spread out over vast distances.
Right.
It's like trying to guard a highway that stretches across an entire ocean.
It makes you wonder what strategies are being explored to protect these cables.
Sure.
It's not like we can just wrap them in concrete or station guards every few miles along the ocean floor. What's being done?
Well, there are a number of strategies being explored,
Okay.
both in terms of prevention and mitigation.
Okay.
Increased surveillance, both above and below the water, is crucial.
Mm-hmm.
You need to know what's happening down there, who's operating near the cables,
Yeah.
and whether any suspicious activity is taking place.
So more underwater cameras, sensors,
Yeah.
drones, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And there's a lot of research going into developing more resilient cables,
Okay.
ones that are harder to damage and have built-in redundancy.
You mean like backup systems, so that if one part of the cable is cut, the internet doesn't go down completely?
Right, think of it like having multiple lanes on a highway. If one lane is blocked, traffic can still flow on the other lanes.
Gotcha.
There are also cables being developed with self-healing capabilities, which sounds pretty sci-fi.
Self-healing cables, what does that even mean? Like underwater robots fixing the internet.
It's not quite that futuristic yet, but the technology is advancing rapidly. Imagine a cable that can detect damage and reroute data through backup pathways automatically without any human intervention.
That's incredible. So even if a cable is cut, either accidentally or intentionally, the internet wouldn't necessarily go down.
Exactly. That's the goal.
Yeah.
To create a more resilient and robust network that can withstand both accidental damage and intentional attacks.
Yeah.
It's all about minimizing disruption and ensuring the free flow of information.
This is starting to sound more hopeful. But technology alone can't solve this problem, right? International cooperation seems like it'll be a key piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. No single country can secure these cables alone.
Right.
It requires a coordinated effort sharing information, conducting joint exercises, and developing protocols for responding to incidents quickly and effectively.
But that's easier said than done, especially given the current state of global politics. Trust is in short supply these days.
It's certainly a challenge,
Yeah.
while building trust and establishing clear lines of communication between countries.
Yeah.
Even those who might be at odds with each other, is essential.
Right.
No one country can afford to have the internet and the global economy that relies on it held hostage by another.
So is there any movement in that direction? Are countries actually coming together to address this issue?
There are some encouraging signs. The International Cable Protection Committee, or ICPC, is a key player in this space.
Okay.
They bring together governments, industry leaders, and academics to develop best practices and share information about cable security.
And what about NATO? They've been increasingly vocal about the threat posed by Russia to undersea cables in the Baltic Sea.
Yes, NATO has recognized this as a critical vulnerability and has established a new center dedicated to protecting undersea infrastructure.
Okay.
They're increasing surveillance, conducting exercises, and working on strengthening their response capabilities.
It sounds like the international community is starting to wake up to the seriousness of this threat.
It's definitely moving in the right direction,
Yeah.
but there's still a lot of work to be done,
Right.
especially in terms of developing a truly unified approach.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about this vast network of cables just crisscrossing the ocean floor,
Yeah.
carrying like the lifeblood of the digital age.
Yeah, it is remarkable.
And it's all surprisingly vulnerable.
It is. And as we've been discussing, the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
The security of these cables is not just a technical issue, it's fundamentally tied to global stability
Right.
and prosperity.
So let's talk solutions. What can be done to protect these cables and make the internet more resilient? In the last part, we talked about technological advancements like self-healing cables and increased surveillance. But what about the human element? Where does international cooperation fit into all of this?
International cooperation is absolutely crucial. No single nation can effectively secure these cables on its own. It's a global challenge that requires a global response.
But as we've discussed, getting countries to work together, especially when there's so much mistrust and geopolitical maneuvering going on, seems like a Herculean task. Where do you even begin?
You start by acknowledging the shared risk and the shared responsibility. The potential consequences of widespread cable disruption are so significant that it forces nations to put aside their differences and find common ground. The internet, for all its complexities, is a shared resource that benefits everyone. Protecting it is in everyone's best interest.
It's like a global version of Neighborhood Watch, right? Everyone looking out for each other, sharing information about suspicious activity, and working together to keep the community safe.
That's a great analogy, and it's already happening to some extent. The International Cable Protection Committee, or ICPC, which we mentioned earlier, is a prime example of this kind of collaborative approach. They facilitate information sharing, develop best practices, and help coordinate responses to incidents.
And what about organizations like NATO? What role are they playing in protecting undersea cables?
NATO has become increasingly aware of the strategic importance of undersea cables, particularly in light of Russia's aggressive actions in the Baltic Sea. They've established a new center dedicated to protecting this critical infrastructure, and they're actively working to enhance their surveillance capabilities and response mechanisms.
So it sounds like there's some progress being made, at least in terms of recognizing the threat and taking steps to address it. But what about concrete actions? What can individual countries do to strengthen their own defenses?
Well, there are several key measures that can be taken at the national level.
Okay.
First, invest in robust surveillance and monitoring systems to detect potential threats early on.
Okay.
This includes underwater sensors, drones, and advanced data analytics to identify suspicious activity.
So basically, you need to know what's happening around those cables in real time.
Exactly. Second, diversify cable routes. Instead of relying on a few main arteries, countries can spread out their network, making it harder for a single attack to disrupt the entire system.
It's like the old adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Precisely. Third, harden the cables themselves.
Okay.
This involves using stronger materials, incorporating redundant cores, and even exploring self-healing technologies that we talked about earlier.
And of course, international cooperation is essential to make all of this work. But even if we manage to secure the cables themselves, What about the landing stations where they connect to land? Those seem like obvious targets as well.
You're right to point that out. Securing landing stations is just as important as protecting the cables themselves. This involves physical security measures, cybersecurity protocols, and even considering redundant landing points to minimize the impact of an attack on any single location.
So it's a multi-layered approach involving technology, international cooperation, and good old-fashioned security.
Exactly, and it's a constantly evolving challenge. As technology advances, so too do the threats. It's a never-ending race to stay ahead of the curve.
It's a lot to think about. But it's clear that we can't afford to ignore this issue. The internet has become so integral to our lives that protecting it is no longer just a matter of convenience. It's a matter of national and global security.
I couldn't agree more. And it's not just about governments and large organizations. Individuals have a role to play as well.
So what can our listeners do to stay informed and maybe even contribute to solutions?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed. Educate yourself about the importance of undersea cables and the challenges involved in protecting them. There are excellent resources available online, including the ICPC website, which provides a wealth of information on this topic.
That's a great tip. And for those who are technically inclined, are there opportunities to get involved in developing new technologies or security solutions?
Absolutely. Many universities and research institutions are working on cutting-edge technologies to improve cable resilience and security. There are also opportunities to work with companies that specialize in undersea cable infrastructure.
And what about for those of us who aren't engineers or cybersecurity experts? Is there anything we can do to make a difference?
Absolutely. You can support organizations that are working on this issue, advocate for greater international cooperation, and raise awareness among your friends and family. The more people understand the importance of this issue, the more pressure there will be on policymakers and industry leaders to take action.
So it's a collective effort involving governments, industry researchers, and even everyday citizens. We all have a stake in the security and stability of the internet.
Exactly. It's a reminder that in our increasingly interconnected world, the challenges we face and the solutions we find require a global perspective and a shared commitment to collaboration.
Well, folks, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of undersea cables. It's been a fascinating journey exploring the critical role these cables play in our digital lives, the threats they face, and the innovative solutions being developed to protect them.
It's a world that's often hidden from view, but its importance is undeniable. And as we've discussed, the future of the internet, and perhaps even the future of global stability, may well depend on how effectively we can safeguard these vital links.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and perhaps even a little bit inspiring. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about the challenges we face, the better equipped we are to create a more secure and resilient future.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay connected.